Okay, let's talk a little bit about this idea of imperialism. Obviously, this week's DBQ is kind of centered on this. There's been some requests for a video made about it. Thanks, Morgan. That was a good idea. So let's talk about some reasons for imperialism between 1867 and 1910. First of all, you have to kind of look at what's going on in the world. This is going on all over the world. It's not just the United States. The United States was actually kind of like industrialization, a little late to the party. England had already been clearly doing this. France, a lot of European countries, Japan. So all of a sudden we have all of these countries that are gobbling up real estate, trying to get this massive empire. The United States kind of realizes this is happening. Couple of reasons for this. Industrialization was kind of a big reason. Now, you could kind of talk about it from the standpoint of I'm looking for a place to sell my goods, because with industrialization now we can mass produce things. I can go from selling 10 a year to 1,000. I need a place to sell those. I can't just sell them in my hometown. I got to start going from coast to coast across the country. And if I sell 1,000, maybe I can go 10,000. And I need a place to sell those. If I can't sell them across the country, maybe I need to go to another remote land. Okay, so industrialization was a big reason. The other part of industrialization was natural resources. Again, if I'm going to produce things on a large scale level, maybe we can't produce the cotton in the South that's needed to produce shirts the way I need to do that, or rubber, or whatever the natural resource was. Maybe I need to go find some area that had that natural resource that I could utilize. Okay, so a lot of countries are going after colonies that had those natural resources that were very, very valuable. Okay, this idea of social Darwinism kind of pops up again. So the ability, so they didn't feel bad about all of a sudden, hey, I made this third world country my colony because I wanted the rubber they produce. I don't feel bad about it because we're naturally more aggressive and smarter, and those people rise to the top. The people that aren't kind of fall to the bottom. So if they're getting used a little bit, that's tough break for them. Okay, so the idea of social Darwinism pops up as a justification for maybe some of this. Besides industrialization, this idea of nationalism definitely plays a big role in the idea of imperialism. Nationalism just simply is pride in your country, and you want to be the best at whatever it is you're going to do. So there was a lot of people out there that said, hey, if we control this big a part of the world, if we control this much, that makes us even better. So if we keep on adding colonies, we're getting bigger, better, stronger, and eventually we'd like to be the best one. The old saying used to be about Great Britain was the sun never set on the British Empire, meaning they had so many colonies that somewhere it was daylight because they were so big and so vast. And a lot of other countries wanted to kind of emulate that. They wanted to be this gigantic resources and colonies and military power. Let's face it. The more people, the more resources you have, the less people wanted to mess with you. If you had to go fight Great Britain, they had all these colonies that they could kind of call in as kind of backup. So people worried about other countries. People worried about other countries getting too big, militarily speaking, because they didn't want them to take over the world and take what you already had as a country. So if you didn't strive to be the best, I also don't want to be the country everybody looks at and says we can get bigger because of them. We can take what they have. Okay, so people did want to be the best, but on the flip side, they wanted to prevent others from having this gigantic advantage, for sure. Worldwide, we were seeing countries do this. A reference you can make, we didn't talk about this a ton in class, but this is definitely something you can bring up, is in the late 1800s, 1884 to 1885, there was something known as the Berlin Conference that was taking place. In essence, this was a lot of European countries met to come up with a organized plan of how they're going to divide up Africa. So basically they were saying, Nigeria, that's mine. I'm going to take that. You take Libya. You take Morocco. You take the Congo. You take whatever. You take South Africa. So they're all going to an orderly plan to kind of divide up Africa. Now, they didn't really take into account that South Africa was already like governed by themselves, and but that's neither here nor there. Okay, in the United States, we had a decision to make. What did we want to do? Like, how did we want to play this? So we're looking at what everybody else is doing and determining what's our role. Remember, up until this point, we had been very much an isolationist country, didn't really want to get involved in world affairs. Well, right around this time, this changes a little bit because we see other countries snatching up property. And again, we want to evolve economically through our industrialization. This worries us a little bit. The other thing is in play, and it's really not in the slides, but I do want to mention it, is we're kind of conflicted with this, with where we came from. We have these ideals of self-government and democracy. So going out and just snatching up a country for ourselves and saying, you are now a U.S. territory, you're a U.S. colony. That definitely conflicts with a lot of our democratic ideals of you govern yourself, you rule yourself. It kind of spits in the wind a little bit on that one. In the late 1800s, you can see we are moving towards this by a couple different pieces of evidence. And I think this is, I believe, one of the documents refers to this. There's a guy by the name of Alfred T. Mahan who realized that we had a pretty weak Navy. During the Civil War, we had kind of built up, but in the 25 years after the Civil War, we had basically let that Navy kind of go to rot and hadn't really expanded it, hadn't really modified it, hadn't really kept it up. So Mahan definitely was out to increase the size and potency of our Navy, and he did a really good job of doing that. We talked about there was a conflict between our ideals and kind of our actions. Well, one of the ways that we tried to justify this was through missionaries. We're going to spread the word of God. So we're going to send missionaries into these places and say, we're going to help teach these savages how to become better. The other ideal also was the idea we're going to spread democracy. So maybe you're from not such a favorable situation. We're going to spread the idea of democracy around a little bit. Okay. Some of the stuff that's dealt with in the documents talking about the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War, remember, was a conflict with Spain over Cuba. Now, there's a lot of things that play here, a lot of things that you can talk about within this DBQ. The Spanish-American War, remember, was a very quick little war that we definitely took care of the Spanish pretty tidily. It was spurred on a lot by yellow journalism. This guy, William Randolph Hearst, got a hold of what was known as the Delome letter. Delome was a Spanish dignitary who sent a letter to Spain basically outlining how he kind of insulted President William McKinley a little bit. Basically, it was way overblown in the media. I think the headline was, "This is the biggest insult to the United States ever." It wasn't really that. It really didn't talk about victimizing Cuba a lot. It really just had a little slap in the little insult towards McKinley and not really that much else. But the news definitely played it out like this was this big deal. Then fast forward to, we had a warship, the USS Maine, who was sunk in the Havana Harbor. And all of a sudden, because of this yellow journalism, everybody jumps to the conclusion like it had to have been Spain. Game on, let's go to war. When we did go to war, went pretty well. Again, didn't take very long. Through the Treaty of Paris, we gained Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Now, here's the point. Remember, we said there's a little bit of a dilemma that happened. We don't want to take away anybody's freedom because of where we came from, yet we're looking maybe to expand as well. We passed something called the Teller Amendment that basically says that if we gain access to Cuba, we are not going to govern them ourselves. So because of that, after the Spanish-American War, we're a little bit hamstrung. We have to kind of give Cuba back to the Cuban people. That was a problem. Later on, we also enact something called the Platt Amendment. The Platt Amendment kind of modifies where we were coming at after the Teller Amendment. Even though we gave Cuba back to Cuba, the Platt Amendment kind of gives us a little bit of an open invitation to get involved in Cuban affairs if they have some sort of financial mishap or somebody threatens Cuba. Then that kind of gives us the open invitation to get back in it. That definitely happens. The other thing we can talk about with imperialism during this time, we annex Hawaii. So we gain Hawaii. There's this thought of manifest destiny that we had during the 1800s, that we were ordained by God to control the continent. And really we had gone from the Atlantic all the way to the Pacific, and we had acquired all that open land that wasn't Canada, that wasn't Mexico. We had gained all that land. So the only other way to expand was to go off the what's now the continental United States. So again, we annex Hawaii, and we purchase from Russia what's now Alaska. It was known as Seward's Folly because the person that purchased it was a guy by the name of William Seward. He paid, I believe, like $7.2 million for Alaska. It ended up being a steal. At the time, people thought, why? Why do you want this? It's frozen land. Who wants this? Little did everybody know that it's loaded with oil. Tons of land. It ended up being a steal and a very, very good purchase. Again, this is the U.S. expanding, and as they see as their God-given right to do. Other things that we can talk about, and let's kind of mention that some of our actions, even though we didn't annex maybe these areas, we did absolutely have an idea that we wanted to get involved. Latin America. We were very involved in Latin America, South America, Mexico, those areas. Teddy Roosevelt had what was called big stick diplomacy, where he said, walk softly and carry a big stick. So he wanted to get what he wanted out of all of these situations. Now, he developed what was called the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, in essence saying if Latin America doesn't have their financial house in order, the U.S. is going to step in and we're going to take care of it. So you keep your house in order, we'll stay out. If you don't, we're going to be in there. It was seen as a little bit intrusive by some Latin American countries, for sure. William Howard Taft, yes, Grant, that William Howard Taft that got stuck in the bathtub, had come up with something called dollar diplomacy, which was going to, instead of being intrusive, they were going to give investments into Latin American countries in exchange basically for this friendship, hopefully. Okay, so again, you can see by the U.S. actions that they are looking to, even though it's not a formal territory, hopefully they're going to have good relationships. They can, again, have markets to trade in. They can have allies if it ever comes to war, all of these things. Now, again, like I said, sometimes they use that dollar diplomacy. Sometimes they use Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy. The Panama Canal was definitely an example of big stick diplomacy, where Teddy Roosevelt wants to make a canal right through Panama. Cuts a lot of time going from the Atlantic to the Pacific instead of having to go all the way around South America. We cut right through it and saves days and weeks shipping things. So he creates a revolution in Panama to get what he wants. Last couple things I want to talk about is the U.S.'s actions outside of the country, how they dealt with other countries. The open door policy was a big deal. There was a lot of Asian countries, a lot of European countries that had eyes on China. Back in these days, China was a very weak country. And a lot of people thought they were ripe for the picking to go out and make trades, take what they wanted. And the United States decided there should be this open door policy where everybody could trade with China and kind of protected their kind of well-being. Teddy Roosevelt also negotiated an end to the war with Japan and Russia. And again, this happened at the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. This was directly a concern of they didn't want Japan or Russia to get too powerful. So by negotiating the end to this war, he wants to protect the balance of power that's happening throughout the world. This is his way of doing that. Last thing is this idea of the gentleman's agreement. This happens in the 1900s. There's a little bit of an issue with Japan. San Francisco decided they didn't want to let Japanese American kids go to school here. That rubbed the Japanese government the wrong way. Teddy Roosevelt stepped in and kind of created a little bit of a negotiation between that, so those Japanese American kids could go to school.